So to make sure that we've got the 3 marks that are available for part A of this question, we have the axes, we've labelled the axes, we have supply and demand curves, which we've labelled, and we've illustrated equilibrium. We don't need to write any additional information or create any sentences to answer this part of the question. So now we move on to the subsections which change one of the initial factors behind this equilibrium position. So the first thing that we're asked to consider is point B. Medical research indicates that eating 2 mangoes a day is beneficial to mental health. So this kind of fits in with the British obsession with giving advice about people's diet and drinking habits. So if in part B this was our initial equilibrium, we need to think about how this information will change this position. So if we think about information that tells people that eating more mangoes is beneficial, this is going to affect, we assume, consumer behaviour rather than supplier behaviour. So what it means is that the thing that's going to change in our diagram is going to be a demand curve. It's going to shift up, indicating that consumers will want more mangoes. And we need to demonstrate that this gives us a new equilibrium indicated by point 2. So again, without giving any sentences or any text, we can illustrate that this piece of information causes there to be greater demand for mangoes, which leads to an increase in the quantity consumed and an increase in the equilibrium price. Part C tells us that there is freak weather in India damaging the mango harvest. So some of you might remember we talked about mangoes in one of our early workshops, and we focused on the fact that India is probably the most important country in terms of producing and consuming mangoes. So freak weather in India is going to affect our initial equilibrium, either through demand behaviour or supply behaviour. If we think about it, it's an agricultural product. Freak weather is going to damage the harvest, so it's going to impact on suppliers. So what we need to do is to change our supply curve. S dash indicating a new supply curve. The arrows show the direction of travel. And if we label the new equilibrium point, point 2, again without any text, we've demonstrated there'll be a lower quantity in the market, but the price will be higher. Part D of the question brings in the topic of trade, which we didn't have time to discuss in detail, but it talks about trade barriers lowered by ASEAN. So this is getting us to think about the role of trading blocs and the importance of ASEAN in a different geographical region, whereas the EU is obviously dominant in the European Union. And easier trade between Asia and the European Union is likely to affect either demand or supply of mangoes. So let's think about it in terms of the first thing that's going to change. So if we had a longer time period, we might explore a sequence of changes following this. 3 marks are available. We want a very simple answer. So in terms of answering this, we move to our diagram for part D. Who's going to be initially affected by this? The initial impact is going to be by suppliers. By removing trade barriers, potentially tariffs and quotas, we're going to see more mangoes supplied into this market, leading to a greater number of sales, and we're going to see a lower equilibrium price. The final subsection of this question in relation to mangoes is talking about a surge in GDP growth within countries that are members of ASEAN of 3% per annum. So it's asking us to think, what's going to be the first effect on the mango equilibrium? Is it going to be through demand of consumers, or is it going to be through the production affecting the supply curve? So as we move to our diagram for part A, remember we've only got 3 marks available. The first thing that's likely to happen, stage 1, is likely to be a higher level of demand, We're not given much information about mangoes within the question, so we're going to assume that they're a normal good. If we have more money, we're going to want more of them. A shift out of the demand curve and a new equilibrium, so we see higher consumption and initially higher price. We don't have time or marks available to consider a more sophisticated analysis, and again, we don't need to offer any text with this, just the diagram. The final part of our question shifts from the mango market to looking at coffee and tea sales on campus. So your initial response should be to look at the question and to identify what's required. You have information on the sales of coffee and tea at one price, and then you're told about a change in the price and some new quantities of coffee and tea. So if you get a question structured like this, your initial response should tell you that a calculation is required. So it's up to you to try to determine from that information which formula or formulae are helpful to us. The second thing that you must deal with to get the full 10 marks is to fully explore what might explain these changes. So that's saying make a calculation, find a result from your calculation and interpret it. And it's only in performing the calculation and giving the interpretation that you can get the full 10 marks. So when we looked at the concept of demand, we found that there were 3 different ways of looking at responsiveness of demand to change in factors, and we called these elasticities of demand, and we developed 3 very simple formulae for looking at them. So if we were looking at the own price elasticity of demand, so how did a good demand for a good change when the price of that good changed, we had the percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. If we were looking at the relationship between 2 goods or 2 services, we would have the percentage change in good A quantity divided by the percentage change in the price of good B. And finally, we looked at income elasticity and how our demand for different types of goods and services changed with income. So to look at this, we have a change in percentage quantity demanded over change in percentage income. So this can potentially be addressed in 2 different ways. We have information on change in the price and quantity of tea and change in the price and quantity of coffee. So we can either look at own price elasticity for coffee and tea, or we could look at a cross price and use information about coffee and tea in the same calculation. Whatever we do, we need to make sure that the terminology we use is accurate in order to explain these changes. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the own price elasticity of demand. So we need the percentage change in tea divided by the percentage change in the price of tea. So the question explicitly told us that prices increase by 25%. So we know that this is an increase, 25%. And we know for coffee it's going to be the same increase. If we look at the quantity of tea, we go from 250 cups to 200 cups of tea. So that's a decrease of 20%. So if we have a 20% decrease divided by an increase of 25%, we get, importantly, the sign is negative and we get a coefficient of 0.8. This is important because it tells us that the demand for tea is inelastic. So this is consistent with it being an unresponsive demand, which suggests that tea is very important. So we have the uniform increase in price for tea and coffee of 25%. If we look at how the quantity of coffee sold was affected, we can see we originally sold 300 cups and now we only sell 200 cups. So we can see that's decreasing by a third, which again gives us a negative result. And the result here is 1.3. So this is telling us that the consumer response is elastic. So people change their coffee drinking behaviour much more than they changed their tea drinking behaviour. We need to try to consider why a response for coffee is greater than a response for tea. So anything you could hypothesize in this area, given the limited information you've got, to do with tea being a more important drink on campus than coffee, is acceptable. You've just got to try and draw our attention to the fact that this is a different result. The other potential way of thinking about this was to say that we have information about two goods and services. So let's combine our information about coffee and tea into the same calculation and look at the cross-price elasticity. So we're trying to find out how demand for tea is going to change when the price of coffee is adjusted. So we know that the price of coffee increased by 25%, so that's going to be on the bottom of our diagram. We went from 250 cups of tea to 200 cups of tea, so that was a decrease in demand of 20%. So this would give us an elasticity. Remember, this sign is as important as the sign for cross-price elasticities, of 0.8. So minus 0.8. So this tells us that it's sizable degree of responsiveness between quantity of tea and price of coffee. But the really important factor that we might not have predicted, and this is where we need to have learned the requisite terminology to go with the calculation, is that if this relationship is negative, it tells us that tea and coffee are actually complementary drinks rather than substitute drinks. Substitutes might have been a more likely outcome. So how can we explain this? Well, maybe the most obvious way to explain this is to say that drinking tea and coffee are complementary activities, because when you go to the cafe, you don't tend to go by yourself, you go with friends. And so you might be a tea drinker, but they're a coffee drinker, and the drinks have got to be consumed together because you're going there as a social activity rather than for individual consumption. That's probably the most obvious way to explain it. So that's the end of question 1, and a separate video will follow for question 2.